I need everyone watching this video to be completely honest with me. Do you feel like you're getting better at the game of Magic the Gathering? When you play across from your opponent, at least in a constructed environment, I know that I have metrics to improve at the game. For example, maybe I've sideboarded better. I've recognized the matchup and said, I don't need to bring in 7 cards, I can just bring in these 5. Or when my opponent goes to remove one of my creatures, maybe I recognize that that doesn't actually prevent me from winning the game, and I should let that happen and save my counterspell for a future spell. These are the type of things that I know in my gameplay that when I do lead to direct results to helping me improve the game. And I'm always improving. As many of you seen the gameplay on my channel, sometimes it's a little lacking, sometimes it's big brain, but more so the former here. But when it comes to something like Commander, how do y'all see yourself improving in Commander? Especially as a longtime Commander player myself, I see that the growth for a lot of players can be more lateral. It can be discovering new things, but not advancing your play forward. I've come up against situations where friends of mine have had really complicated stack interactions that they didn't know how to resolve because they didn't understand the way the stack worked properly because of their lack of knowledge when it came to situations like this. Not a lot of these things happen in Commander based on the power level of the pod you're in. And it's kind of what I want to go into today. I came across a video that just got posted by the Distraction Makers, one of my personal favorites on the channel. Many of you are probably already subscribed to them, and they just posted a video about how Magic has changed and how getting better at the game is really different depending on the format that you're playing. The divide between Commander and Constructed has created this further divide within the way that we grow our skills in spell slinging in the game of Magic the Gathering, and how us as Planeswalkers wield our spells to not only further our goals and our plans, but also ultimately win the battles that we pick here. So that's what I'm hoping the video goes into. Let's hop right into it here. And of course, if you want to see more content like this, give me a like down below. Let me know what videos you maybe want to see me react to or just provide further commentary on. And of course, if you want to see more content on anything and everything, just subscribe down below. Just subscribe the button. Y'all know why you're all on this channel, okay? Just subscribe.
Distraction Makers.
Sort of a trend that we've been seeing is that Magic is sort of shifting as it shifts away from sort of competitive play and more towards casual play. The way that a player feels like they're getting better at the game or progressing has changed. The focus has shifted.
Just what I was saying in the intro.
Before we get further into talking about progression today, if you like our videos here on Distraction Makers, give us a like, maybe consider subscribing.
Please do.
And if you're really invested, we have a Discord.
We can define progression, clump them together as vertical and horizontal progression. Vertically, the way I think about progression is I tend to have like sort of 6 different categories of progression, 3 for each horizontal and vertical. One being mastery, that's mastering the game interaction itself. Challenge is different challenges the game is sort of delivering to the player. Variable is number going up. That's pretty standard. All that is vertical progression. Mm-hmm. Horizontal progression being toy. That's basically you playing with different types of decks. Not any deck is better or worse than the other, but that's just you playing with something different.
I feel like this is the type of horizontal progression that a lot of Commander players get into. I think we all know the person in our pod that builds a lot of decks, doesn't really play them. And I think over the years, a lot of Commander content creators have done a really good job of advocating for just building less decks and improving the ones you have. I know one thing that I've started doing personally is with the Mothman EDH deck that I have. I actually have 2 versions of it, and I almost want to build a third, where one version is a CEDH version, the one that's kind of straight off the content that's being posted on YouTube, and another one is a personal build of mine that's maybe kind of lower power level, you know, about a 6 or a 7 type of thing. And that one has more of a mill or like go wide type of direction. It's not necessarily feeding heavy into like a food chain combo. And so that is one way that I can use one of my decks and create variable lines of play. And obviously, you know, there's a little bit of accessibility here where I do have access to printers, so I can print out a bunch of proxies and my pods are okay with it. But I myself have about like 5-6 decks that I just cycle in between. And I love to change them over time, but I don't know if I'm really interested in building too much more decks unless they're interesting to me. So this is one example of, I guess, that horizontal progression where folks will think that they will just go into a new color pie. Like, you know, a Simic player will go into,
would just be like,
a Simic player will go into like a Rakdos deck and they think they're improving at the game. Well, no, you may just build your Rakdos deck in a very similar way to your Simic deck, where maybe you have more card draw, like in black in comparison to blue. And then in the red part, you might have some impulse draw as well, but, you know, a little bit of mana, right? Like you have some immediate mana and more mana rocks, and you're kind of building that green aspect of your Simic deck. And you end up just building like the same deck because you want to do the same thing over and over again, but you're not actually exploring a new avenue of play to open yourself up to maybe like an aristocrat strategy or something like an aggro strategy. You're kind of just building the same deck, but with a commander that feels slightly different, because now this new commander has like dice rolling, and the other commander you had was just land ramp and draw. Like, let's say it was Tatiova, and all of a sudden you're just building this new one for the exact same value. You're ramping, you're drawing cards, and you're playing big things. Did you actually learn anything new? I mean, that's from a deck building perspective. I think in general, I advocate for building less commander decks and exploring the ones that you've already made and deconstructing the ones that you have made. I think us commander players fall into the trap of building too much and
you
not
being
playing
a
as
member
much.
of the community, expanding your vocabulary, learning more about the game itself. So those are the different categories of progression that I think of.
Right. Okay. So part of why I think so many players are sort of kind of feeling this tension with what's going on in Magic right now, and you know, we had a video come out a little bit ago that was talking about how we're sort of seeing Magic change, and I think one of the most the intersection of change here is in the way that players are sort of being rewarded for playing the game now. Is that what is motivating a player in Commander is much different than what motivated a player in like 1v1 Standard. And that a player's playing 1v1 Standard for sort of the vertical progression, and a lot of Commander players are playing for the horizontal progression in this variety and social and aesthetic kind of way, where, you know, so I think when it's kind of weird, right? Because in some ways you kind of want these two audiences to almost be separate from each other.
At one point they were separate, and I think that's where we end up sort of seeing people like, I don't know, bumping heads, I guess.
Right. And so when those two player bases start to mix, you sort of get this mismatch in what those players value. And
so I see this definitely in myself, where I think a lot of people that have seen me kind of slowly get back into Commander now have seen like some of the videos that I put out there, some of the things that I talk about, and especially in the ways for those of you that have played with me, know that I definitely lean towards more combo. I want like a very direct plan in the way that I build my commander decks. And I've been trying to come off of that ledge, because that type of thinking like leans very much into the EDH or CEDH combo, high power level, 8-9 power level type of decks, where they're very hyper focused. They, I guess, don't fall within the spirit of the format, you know, playing a lot of fetches and tutors in a singleton format, really directing you into 1 to 2 plans. And I think that just comes from my want as a constructed player to maybe not necessarily have the same plan every game, which is kind of why I like the 8 power level of EDH, where you do have a concerted plan, but it's kind of just like a powerful combination of a couple of plans coming together. And that's how I like to build my decks there. CEDH is obviously nice in the sense that you're always doing the same thing every time. You always have to kind of think about like what everyone else is doing. And it's just like an extension of constructed play, where you are forcing your opponent to have the counter spell, you're forcing them to have the land or this spell or whatever. And it comes from that. And that's where my intersectionality like forces me into EDH. And I have to then take my EDH brain and kind of change the way I'm thinking, which is why I always force myself to play a group hug strategy and change the way that I think about value, how I want to work with the table, politicking. I find like a deck like that has really changed my perspective from a constructed player coming into Commander, especially just in the long term. I think a lot of people have a lot of negative connotations about group hug. And I think in many ways, like a lot of those people, especially content creators that I've come across, I think a lot of those are probably just more chronically EDH players. Like group hug decks like have their own problems with them, but I think they're very valuable for the average commander player, and especially for the average constructed player coming into commander. They teach a lot of politicking. They teach a lot of different group dynamics that you just don't get in constructed play, and then you can ignore in constructed 1v1. So I definitely see like where this intersectionality comes in, how I have to make conscious decisions to be an EDH player and not a modern player when it comes to playing a multiplayer format.
They start to sort of be in conflict with each other as those axes are operating in two different directions.
Yeah.
So you get sort of a 1v1 style Magic player come into a commander environment, and suddenly everybody's like the power level of everybody's deck has to start coming up because they're more focused on how do I design my commander deck to do a thing and do it every time in a very efficient way.
Literally what I was talking about.
And a lot of the things that we end up talking about on our channel are in that, like, okay, well, you know, commander was intended to be designed in this way that sort of disincentivizes that style of play, but there still is an optimal way to play commander, and the only way that people don't play optimally in commander is by choice. This is why commander in small groups works.
It's great,
right? Is that when you're
so, you know, always reminding yourself that when you as a commander player, and I think this is why a lot of constructed players can maybe like lean away from it, or they don't really appreciate the discourse that happens, especially on Twitter, where a lot of people will have these opinions about politicking, about what it means to be morally correct in a CEDH game, and they don't understand like the larger discourse amongst us, and it doesn't really make sense for a constructed player whatsoever. But I think it's like really important to understand the difference between optimal versus fun in Commander, because I think like largely speaking, it's always correct to make the fun play, not the optimal play. And those are very, very different things a lot of the time. The optimal thing is something that you don't respond to your opponent's spell. You let the other players in the group do so, or you don't remove this creature because this creature stops your opponent more often. Like you stops your opponent more than you. So you kind of bite the dust there, and you don't that's the optimal play. But then the fun play is maybe you do destroy that creature, and then you create like a truce with that player, and then you create some politicking, and you gain some back and forth with them where you say, hey, I'll destroy this creature that's exiling your graveyard as a Marin player, and you know, maybe you don't swing at me, you don't steal my creatures, or you don't do any negative things to me for a couple of turns. And so this is where that fun play comes into play there. And in some ways, I guess people could argue that is quote unquote the optimal thing. Maybe you're behind and you need to gain some type of like political advantage. But in an objective, what's on the board, what's in your hand, what's in the graveyard, like what resource you have access to type of optimal, that would not be necessarily the optimal thing to do. Working with your percentages, you try and draw your cards. And again, optimal versus the fun play, always make the fun play, because at the end of the day, statistically speaking, in a 4-player pod that you play in a vacuum, you're only winning 25% of the time, assuming everything's equal, right? You are 1 out of 4 players, you are winning 25% of the time. I don't know, like if your optimal plays let you go from 25% to 30%, I don't know how much valuable that really is to you as an individual person. I can tell you, statistically speaking, it's probably not that much more worth it. So if you're losing 75% of the time, why not have fun doing so? But that's my thoughts.
Group, when you've all sort of gotten into the game at the same time, and all of your sort of mastery levels are similar, and you're sort of rising together, because inevitably you rise, there's nothing you can really do to stop that. When you're in that environment, I think Commander can shine.
Right.
But when there's any kind of mismatch here,
the minute one person leaves that cube or that group, and they go and watch hundreds of hours of YouTube videos and get super into deck constructing, and no one else does that, you're going to start butting heads. Something's going to happen. Progression is an inevitability in any game.
And so this is something that happened with my casual friend group. Like my friend group doesn't necessarily play Commander too often now. They do every so often just to kind of, see what's going on in Magic and just kind of more so to hang out with me, because in the group, I'm the one that primarily plays Magic. And for them, there's one person in my group that doesn't want to go to the LGS. That's, not something that they want to do, whether it be not something comfortable for them, like a step too far for them, the type of people that they want to meet you know, they may not be as social of a person in that aspect, and there's someone else that has gone to constructed Magic with me but maybe doesn't want to go out as much, and then there's another player that, you know, does want to improve their decks, but they kind of go all the way. Like when they make an improvement, it's not a small adjustment, like they want to add all the cards and make it optimal. So the group dynamics are very different, and me as a constructed player, as a content creator, in terms of what I absorb, like every time they play with me, they come across new cards, and I try and like be conscientious about like what I'm playing, when I'm playing it, not to overwhelm them. Like I don't want to always introduce like new things to them. Every time they play down, I'm not going to sit down with like a brand new you know, Chun-Li deck that has only Transformers cards, and, you know, it has Rick Grimes in it, and like, you know, I'm not going to overwhelm them with that. I feel like it's just there for shock value and not actually for gameplay. So I think a lot of ways, like I am this person, I feel like, in many ways, where I kind of leave that group and I go and watch game nights and other Commander pieces of content and constructed content. I come back and I try and apply that, but I also have to understand that may be a little jarring to my group, and so I have to adjust and I have to make that change. And I definitely have the opportunity to play Commander outside of that group, which is why I'm able to like feed my lust for playing new Magic cards over there. But maybe that's not true for
it's just
people that play with just one group.
How far progression can go in different ways differs amongst games. Some games, there's not really a lot of toys to choose from or whatever, so there's not a lot of variety. Some games, very easy to master. Magic has always had a very long tail of mastery.
Yeah.
To try and...
So the design focus has been on mastery, right? That's kind of what we're talking about.
Ask the average Commander player like how to resolve certain levels of layers. I'm telling you, the average Commander player would not be able to do it properly, like at all. I had a question the other day when I walked into the LGS where someone, like a Commander table, was asking me, because they knew I came in from Modern. They asked me like how Scoot Swarm would resolve with like a certain, like they had a certain number of lands, so the Scoot Swarm was creating copies of the Scoot Swarm, and they were asking me what would happen when these lands came into play. Would each Scoot Swarm see each land? And I'm like, no, there's only one Scoot Swarm on the field right now that sees all the lands coming in. You don't have the Scoot Swarm create the copies and then those copies see all of those lands. Like they didn't know how to resolve that because so many things were happening at once. They didn't know how to resolve this stack. And this is honestly, in my opinion, again, I'm don't mean this in a way to sound elitist. Like this to me is a very basic interaction. Because of in a constructed environment, I have come across a similar situation, especially with like, you know, Nantuko and Titan players, and like I've seen the green decks do similar things. So I know how to resolve a stack like this. But again, you ask the average Commander player like how a layer system resolves when you have like Blood Moon on top of a -1/-1 that may affect a creature that kills the Blood Moon, but then, you know, that you have like another moon effect that comes on top of that, but then like a replacement effect that, like, you know, again, like they don't know. Heck, the constructed players barely know.
Previous video is that like when the incentives of design and the player base are in alignment, everything sort of clicks and makes sense, right? Where it's like, well, we're designing for mastery and we're expecting our players to be playing for mastery. Therefore, we are in alignment with our design decisions. And now that we're in the middle of this shift in this weird period of time, players who sought that mastery or have been playing Magic for like, and franchise players have been playing a long time are going, what happened to my mastery?
Right.
You know?
And I think that what has started to shift, it's been going for a little while. Wizards has seemed to start leaning a little bit more into variable progression instead of progression of mastery. And so you're starting to see more power creep than we've seen in previous years. Right.
Well, let's talk about variable progression for a minute in terms of its manifestation within Magic.
Right. So variable progression is just number go up. It's the most common form of progression that you end up seeing in games. And usually how variable progression used to work was if you got a basic land in a pack or whatever, and when you're building a deck, you go, okay, great, a basic land. But then you get a dual land, and you go, oh, that's better than a basic land, probably, so I'm going to put that in my deck. That's variable.
Do y'all remember the first time you realized, like, how good a shock land was versus a force tap land? Like a card that says enters tapped versus a card that says you can pay 2 life and have it come in untapped. Do you all remember that clue in moment? And then you realize even further how much of a difference that is in something like Legacy, where you have the actual dual lands that don't actually have an option to come in tapped. They do come in untapped, but they don't have to pay any life, right? Like, when's the first time you clued into this, especially with fetch lands? When's the first time you clued into the fact that fetch lands are actually, like, the fetch land cycle is fundamentally one of the most broken, if not the most broken cycle of cards in Magic's history? When is the first time you clued into something like that? Is it right now, or did you realize that kind of subtly before?
Progression.
Stuff
you
like
have
that's
a
always
card
interesting
that is
for a
now
Magic
just
player.
strictly better than a previous card.
Right. And so, like, with Magic, as opposed to sort of maybe a digital game, and you can even see this on Magic Arena, they can kind of bring some of this in, is in a video game, you can have like a level, right? Like, your character is level 1, then level 2, then level 3. Magic doesn't really have that, but you sort of can level up your individual cards, right? By broadening your collection, right? You might have a shock in your deck, and then you upgrade it to a lightning bolt at some point or something like that.
Now, it can get more fine-tuned, but that's like a form of mastery of deck building, because at some point it gets beyond like, oh well, yeah, shock is worse than lightning bolt. At a certain point you have to just figure out like, well, is this spell going to be more optimal for my deck than lightning bolt? And that gets more complex.
Right. So
this is kind of referring to, this can be thought of like in terms of sideboard cards, like or actually even in terms of main board cards, like, is something like Spell Pierce valuable to you in the main board, or should you be playing Stern Scolding? And I guess Stern Scolding is a bit more limiting in your sideboard, but do you then play a hard counter spell like Counterspell for blue that counters any spell? Or is the value of Stern Scolding at 1 more valuable to you in terms of flexibility at cost in your sideboard, or is countering something hard for 2 more valuable? And then it gets even more complicated. If you have a free counter spell like Pact of Negation, is countering that spell for free more valuable to you, even with its downside of forcing you to pay a cost? And for combo decks, the decision is more easy. But as a first-time combo player, like, learning that, like understanding why a card like that is an upgrade for you versus something like Spell Pierce. Like, a lot of times for a combo deck, yeah, Spell Pierce is going to do the job. But again, a lot of that time you need that 1 mana, that 1 blue, whatever it might be, versus that spell costing 0. And that's obviously an easier metric to understand, but I think a lot of people don't understand the value between 0 and costing 1.
I think that's what's so interesting here, and one of the reasons why we probably have seen more power creep as of late is that when you're the example of shock or lightning bolt, right? That's like really straightforward to a player. They read one card, well, this one does 2 damage for one red, and this one does 3 damage for one red.
Simple.
Obviously, I want the one that does 3 damage. Yeah. And so it's a really easy way to make a player feel like they are getting better, like that their deck is better, that they're better at the game, that they have more power, right? Like that's like a really straightforward thing, and that's usually why variable progression is utilized. Is like, it's a really clear way to tell players, hey, you're getting better.
This is something that especially games with younger demographics relied on. So the Pokemon trading card game was very good at doing this, still is very good at doing this, and then and Yu-Gi-Oh did this for a long time. Probably still does. I don't know.
Sure, right. More and so power and when we look at sort of the power creep-esque progression of the past, or complexity creep of the past, it sort of relied on a player base that was much more focused on mastery, right? We had a player base that was really interested in intricacies of, well, what archetype does this card go into? What role does it play in my deck? Where does it fall in my mana curve? How to, like, I did a bunch of other things to consider, right? And now we've sort of shifted to a player base that is much less interested in that kind of stuff, and they're more interested in something that might just be more powerful. Like, I can read the numbers on the card and go, I know this card's better than the card that's in my deck. I'm going to swap those out.
Right.
And
so kind of talking the difference between, like, a constructed player would make that differentiation between, a card being good in standard versus in modern, right? Cards in standard might be more so evaluated around 2 toughness or higher CMC or maybe like lower CMC, whatever it might be. Because in modern, you have cards like Fatal Push and you have Lightning Bolt, you have Prismatic Ending. These are the type of removal spells that you're working with. Heck, even Solitude as well. That kind of changes the game, but you lose a card off of that. Regardless, like, Fatal Push kind of holding down like 2 CMC or less creatures and the 3 toughness threshold for lightning bolts being so important. And it's really presenting the value past that removal, which is why cards like Ragavan are so powerful. Yes, it dies to Orcish Bowmasters. Yes, it dies to Fatal Push. Yes, it dies to Bolt. But if you don't have those, the card will single-handedly just win you the game after like one swing in terms of the value that it provides. It's so backbreaking, right? And that is where in a constructed environment like Standard, like you get away with more things like that. Like you can play 2 CMC creatures because it's fine. Like the removal is probably it probably costs 2 CMC or it costs 3 CMC, and you could get away with playing things like a lot more creatures at 3 because like the red base removal might be dealing 1 damage to everything, or dealing 2 damage. Like it's a lot more controlled. But now in EDH, because a lot of people don't play like single target removal, which is, by the way, like a big level up moment for Commander players. You should be playing more single target removal than you are right now on average. And a lot of these people can just get away with playing big dumb cards because people are looking at their hand. They're like, oh, I don't like, how many times have you played a game of EDH? Let me know in the comment section down below. How many times have you played a game of EDH where your opponent sees a card get played, or even you might say this, or a couple of cards get played and they say, oh, I don't have the board wipe, but it could just be solved with a single target removal. It could just be solved with a Path to Exile, a Swords to Plowshares, a Doomblade. How many times have they said, I don't have the board wipe, not I don't have the Path to Exile. I don't have like I don't have the Cyclonic Rift, but they should have said, I don't have the counterspell. Like these simple decisions that they can make could punish things like this, where people just swap out a card and they play a big dumb thing. And yes, this card is quote unquote strictly better in my deck because although this card gets me to lose 2 life, and that would mean in all other scenarios it's worse, my commander actually wants me to lose life when I play spells. So this is actually strictly better in this case. So regardless, it's a better card, but it affects you more because the deck building decisions that you make as a commander player. So these are the ways that you don't improve as a commander player. Other players can, but you feel like you aren't making deck building decisions that work around some of the decisions that your opponents are making. Just something to think about.
You know, again, I just want to be really clear that neither one of these is right or wrong.
Right.
They are just different.
Yeah, I think there's going to be people that, because they're so invested in past Magic and past Magic's design philosophies, they're going to see this as like a full negative. So we posted a video recently where we talk about how Magic is changing, and it's changing more geared towards commander players. And it's so funny because we get a lot of people on here that are, I think, in a similar boat to you. They played a lot at one point in time. Now the game is kind of different. It's not something that they really are as invested in. They don't like Commander quite as much. And then we also get Commander people. They're just like, we just like Commander. So like, it's like there's clearly an audience that is also into this, and they are coming into this with that concept of variable progression, and it's not like a lesser game for these people.
Well, I think where things get sticky is that people who are focused on the mastery part of the game are going to feel undercut by this variable progression. That's where I think the weirdness comes in. And when we see these tournament scenes falling apart because cards are just too powerful, that I think can become like, you start to sort of feel like, oh, I need to be protective of this. What's going on here? They're making these horrible mistakes. But in reality, they are just serving the majority of the audience, which you are not necessarily.
This right here is for all legacy players. These are the people that have been complaining for so long that Commander design has ruined their format. Case in point, literally, oh Lord, I'm trying to make a point. I'm forgetting the name of the card. What, like, blue 1 for a 3/1. It has protection from a player. And that card specifically works in the commander environment because you only get protection from one player. You choose a player and you get protection from it. So the spells they cast and the things they do, they can't interact with this card. But in a legacy constructed 1v1 environment, that type of card is absolutely insane. And with Legacy's legality and Vintage's legality being all cards, these are the type of things where Wizards is designing interactions and cards for the majority. They're designing it for commander players. They've gone on record and said they did not test that card specifically for constructed players or did it that well. Like, they don't test for vintage and legacy that much. If a card breaks vintage and legacy, like, they're not testing for the fact that Ren and 6 needs to get banned in legacy. They're not testing for the fact that Grief needs to get banned in legacy. They are testing for, especially in the set that Grief came out without Commander product, they were testing it for Modern specifically. And at this point, Grief has a terrible play pattern and we should probably ban it. But these are the type of, like, this is literally just like a PSA. This is calling out legacy players without calling out legacy players. This is how they feel, because the game, the cards that enter their format and affect their daily aren't designed for them, but they affect their daily. Right. And this is where people have this cognitive dissonance of not every product is for them, where people, they get told and they get gaslit into saying that not every product is for them. You shouldn't have product fatigue, but you kind of do have to keep up with it as a player in those formats, because all of a sudden these cards are legal in your formats. But Wizards of the Coast doesn't test for these cards in your format, but they're insane in your format. They are affecting your tournaments. They're affecting your Friday night legacy, whatever it might be, which is really unfortunate. This is just the truth of the matter, right? When they are making a good business decision to make cards and test for the majority, but that also affects maybe a vocal minority of players that have loud voices in legacy.
And that's a frustrating experience.
Yeah.
To feel like, well, this was my game, and now it feels like it's sort of slipping away. And I also think that Commander players can feel frustrated because they're now on this track of variable progression that they don't necessarily want to be on, but they don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
If like one person in your group buys a new precon.
So I'm gonna touch on this point without even watching the video. I know where this is going. So you sit across from someone who's gone back into Commander for the first time in 4 years. You play Dockside Extortionist. I'm making the assumption Dockside is printed within the last like 3 years. I'm pretty sure it is. Maybe it's older. But they don't know what Dockside is. They play Dockside Extortionist. All of a sudden, for 2 mana, they are at like turn 8 based on the amount of mana on the like treasure they gain. They are so far ahead. They are skyrocketed ahead. And as a player, you're looking at cards like this and you're looking at the free red spells where if you control your commander, you can cast this for free and you can redirect a spell like as another red spell alongside the Dockside Extortionist. They're seeing these spells that are outdoing the spells that they've played with before. And they feel not only a sense of FOMO, but a sense that they are behind. They are not playing the cards that are optimal to them. And I think a lot of good players can recognize that, hey, not every deck is meant to have Dockside Extortionist. It probably is optimal that if you're a red deck, chances are you should be playing Dockside Extortionist. It's just like how most blue decks probably should be playing Cyclonic Rift, unless there's a specific niche case where that deck doesn't want that for some reason. But I'd be really hard pressed for someone to actually convince me of that, unless you're making a specific deck building restriction against yourself. That is just at the end of the day what is happening, which is really unfortunate because these Commander players need to keep up. They go from pod to pod to pod. They see a new commander, a new precon, the next set that comes out. All of a sudden they thought they could wait, but then Modern Horizons 3 has a set of precons as well. All of a sudden colorless decks are skyrocketed to the moon. Like, they didn't even think colorless decks could be possible, but all of a sudden the opponent's Zuladoc deck is absolutely annihilating your face in, and you don't know what to do, because you're not caught up and you just went with the mantra of this product isn't for you, which is really unfortunate.
And you guys have been playing with cards that are 5 years old. Suddenly everybody's got to buy new stuff because that precon's going to be way more powerful.
Right. And where previously you may have been able to just sort of like sit back on a set or two, way back in the day, now you can't really do that. In almost every single set, there's always something new that people are like, well, this card's insane, this card's so good. It's, you know,
and Diskin, and I'll take like personal fault for this. I think content creators like they, you know, it's part of the job to do this, but they kind of add to this in a way where, you know, they'll shoot out a tweet and they'll be like, so this is insane, right? Or wow, rat decks tier 1, right? Like, they'll see a card that gets spoiled and they'll be like, this is going into my X deck in Esper, and they're like, this is the new Rakdos staple, and they'll say things like this that get people to get in and think about this, and then all of a sudden they feel like they have to care about this set, they need to pay attention to this, and it creates this want, this need. And content creators do kind of promote to this, and they add to this unfortunate feeling that a lot of players had. And a lot of people can say that this is like a personal battle that you have to fight with, but again, it's really unfortunate when you sit across from a table, you forcibly decide to skip 2 sets, and all of a sudden you feel like your 2-3 monocolor deck, whatever, is a lot worse because you missed out on this precon, this staple, this product, like whatever it might be. You didn't get that card, and you feel like you're missing out on this super sweet combo that's literally better than what you're doing right now and could actually tutor up these other 2 pieces, or it loses you more life in a deck that wants you to lose life. Like you feel like you're not making the optimal play, and then you go down this slippery slope where, because of the hype that's being created around all these products and your need to become better at this game because your opponents are doing better things, you start to get into the slippery slope situation of how you don't want to play optimally, but you're kind of, the FOMO is making you feel like you need to play optimally. Like you need to make these swaps, which ultimately makes your deck more optimal and maybe less fun, because the deck card you replace may actually be more fun because of some of the other abilities on it, but the other card is more optimal, and you feel like it would strengthen your deck because you see your opponent do something cool, which is an insane combo, but it may be the fun play for them, but based on how your deck is built, it may actually be a quote unquote optimal play, and replacing your current card may actually be like
this old card that we all play in our commander decks, but it's better now, and so they just put that in.
Right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about drawbacks here with either kind of progression. Vertical progression, sort of solely focused on challenge and mastery. That can be hard to get new players involved in. Yeah. It's a very particular type of player motivation that, it's just not that appealing to some people.
Look at Elden Ring.
Oh, right.
The Souls games are like a great example of this, because they have variable progression, and it's almost laughably like irrelevant.
Really right. It matters some. But not a lot.
And so, but yeah, that game franchise has grown over time, but it's very much a cult following up until Elden Ring. Yes. And Elden Ring only worked because they allowed players ways of avoiding